The boy was 4 years old when he began asking to go home, not the home where he lived, not the house where his parents tucked him in at night, where his toys were arranged along the shelf, where his name was written in crayon on the bedroom wall. A different home, one his parents had never heard of. One they were reasonably certain did not exist, at least not in any place their son had ever been. At first, they treated it the way most parents would. A phase, an imaginary world. The kind of elaborate inner life that young children construct and then quietly abandon by the time they start school. They nodded when he talked. They asked gentle questions. They waited for it to pass. It didn't pass. Instead, it became more specific, more detailed, more difficult to dismiss. He began describing rooms he had never entered, streets he had never walked, a family that was not his own, and eventually, a name. Not his name, but the name he said he used to have, in a life he said had ended before this one began. What followed would eventually reach the desk of one of the world's most methodical researchers into children's past life memories, and would become one of the cases that even committed skeptics find genuinely difficult to set aside. This is where it begins. James Leininger was born in 1998 in Louisiana. By most accounts, his early childhood was unremarkable in all the ways that matter: a loving home, an attentive mother named Andrea, a father named Bruce who worked in business consulting and described himself at that point in his life as a pragmatic man not given to supernatural thinking. The first signs appeared when James was around 2 years old. His parents had taken him to a local flight museum, the kind of educational outing that parents of small children arrange without any particular expectation. James was transfixed. He stood in front of the aircraft displays for longer than seemed typical for a toddler. He pointed. He identified things. He used words that 2-year-olds do not generally use. His parents noted it with the quiet curiosity of people who have not yet understood what they are witnessing. The nightmares came shortly after. They were not the vague disturbances that characterize ordinary childhood sleep disruption. James would wake screaming, his small body rigid, repeating the same urgent fragments: a plane on fire, a crash, an inability to escape. The episodes were frequent enough and intense enough that his mother began keeping a record of them, writing down what he said in the moments after waking, before the images dissolved. What she recorded did not read like the residue of a frightened imagination. It read like the residue of a specific memory. James told her the plane had been shot. He told her it had gone down in water. He told her the name of the boat the plane had taken off from. He told her the name of a friend who had died. And he told her his own name, not James Leininger, but James Huston. James Huston Jr. Bruce Leininger was not a man who wanted this story to be true. By his own admission, he spent months looking for rational explanations, ways to account for the details his son was producing without accepting the premise that seemed to be assembling itself in front of him. He researched Second World War aviation history. He traced ship records. He followed the name his son had given, one detail at a time, into archives and databases and eventually into contact with surviving members of a squadron that had operated in the Pacific Theater. What he found did not provide the reassurance he had been looking for. A pilot named James Huston Jr. had served with Fighter Squadron VF-20 aboard the USS Natoma Bay. He had been killed in action in 1945 near Iwo Jima. His plane had been struck and had gone down in the water. He had been 21 years old. The name of the ship James Leininger had mentioned, a name the boy had begun using before his father had conducted any research, matched. At this point, a reasonable person might begin searching for alternative explanations. And that is not only fair, it is necessary, because the history of extraordinary claims about children and past lives contains a significant quantity of cases that, under scrutiny, reveal ordinary explanations: suggestion, contamination, cultural transmission, a detail a child overheard and later incorporated into a more elaborate narrative. The power of a parent who wants to believe, unconsciously shaping a child's story toward confirmation. These possibilities deserve serious consideration, and the researchers who have studied the Leininger case have applied them. Dr. Jim Tucker, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who has dedicated decades to the systematic investigation of children's past life claims, evaluated the case with particular attention to the question of contamination. Whether James could have acquired his knowledge through ordinary channels before his parents began investigating. The timeline matters here. The earliest details James produced, the ship name, the friend's name, the nature of the crash, appeared before his father had begun researching. Bruce Leininger has described the experience of discovering, after the fact, that the information his son had been volunteering matched historical records he had not yet found. The sequence, if accurately reported, presents a genuine methodological challenge for the contamination hypothesis. Tucker has noted this case in his research. He has not claimed it proves reincarnation. What he has argued is that it represents the kind of documented specificity that makes a simple dismissal intellectually unsatisfying. The details were not generic. They were not the kind of vague impressions that could fit any number of historical scenarios. They were specific enough to be falsifiable, and they were not falsified. But here is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because the name was only the beginning. James Leininger, as he grew slightly older and became capable of more articulate conversation, began adding details that his parents had not sought and had not suggested. He described the appearance of the pilot. He described specific aspects of the aircraft. He described what the moment of impact had felt like, or at least what he said it had felt like. He also described other members of the squadron by name, 3 names in particular: Jack Larson, Leon Connor, and Walter Devlin. Historical records confirmed that individuals with these names had served with Fighter Squadron VF-20. James had not been shown these names. His parents had not known them when James first produced them. The conventional explanation, that a child absorbed this information through ordinary environmental exposure and then unconsciously reassembled it into a coherent narrative, requires believing that a toddler managed to internalize an unusually specific body of historical information and then produce it selectively, consistently, and in a way that tracked with verifiable records his parents had not yet consulted. This does not mean the explanation is impossible. Memory is strange. Childhood cognition is strange. The mechanisms by which information enters and is stored in a developing mind are not fully understood. There may be pathways for information acquisition that current developmental psychology has not fully mapped, but the conventional explanation requires its own set of assumptions that are not obviously less demanding than the alternative. What does the alternative actually claim? The researchers who take cases like this seriously are not, for the most part, making straightforward claims about the soul traveling between lifetimes in the way popular culture imagines it. The academic framing is more careful than that. Dr. Tucker, building on the foundational work of his predecessor at the University of Virginia, Dr. Ian Stevenson, has proposed that cases like James Leininger raise a specific and serious question: whether consciousness, or some component of what we experience as personal identity, can persist beyond biological death and associate itself with a new developing mind. This is not a claim they assert as proven. It is a hypothesis they argue the evidence does not allow us to simply dismiss. Stevenson spent 40 years collecting and evaluating past life cases from multiple cultures, with particular attention to cases that contained verifiable specifics: names, locations, relationships, causes of death that could be independently investigated. He documented over 3,000 cases. He did not claim that all of them, or even most of them, demonstrated survival of consciousness. He claimed that a subset, a much smaller number, contained a level of verified specificity that he believed was not adequately explained by fraud, fantasy, or coincidence. The Leininger case came after Stevenson's most active research period, but it follows the pattern he identified as methodologically significant: early onset, spontaneous unprompted statements, specific verifiable details, and cessation of the memories as the child grew older. A pattern that recurs across cultures, across continents, and across very different belief systems. That cross-cultural consistency is one of the features that researchers find hardest to dismiss. If this phenomenon were entirely the product of cultural suggestion, children absorbing a belief in reincarnation and constructing narratives around it, then the cases would be expected to cluster in cultures where reincarnation is religiously normalized. They do appear more frequently in such cultures, which is itself a complicating factor. but they also appear persistently in cultures where reincarnation is not a dominant belief, including the American Christian household in which James Leininger grew up. The skeptical community has not been silent on cases like this, and that scrutiny is worth engaging honestly. One significant objection is the question of verification timing. In the Leininger case, the father's investigation and the child's statements developed in parallel, meaning there is a period during which Bruce Leininger was actively researching and simultaneously asking his son questions. Even with the best intentions, a parent conducting that kind of investigation could inadvertently shape the child's account through the questions they ask, the reactions they show, the information they inadvertently reveal. This is not an accusation of deliberate deception. It is a structural problem that affects even the most sincere and careful families. The moment a parent begins investigating a child's claim, the conditions for clean data collection have been compromised. Critics have also pointed to the challenge of establishing what counts as a successful match. If a child provides 20 details and 15 can be verified while 5 cannot, does that constitute evidence? And how many of those 15 could have matched any number of historical individuals given the volume of people who died in the Second World War? These are legitimate methodological concerns. Tucker and others in the field acknowledge them. The response, typically, is that the evaluation depends on specificity, that the name of a specific ship combined with the name of a specific pilot, combined with the names of specific fellow squadron members, in a child who was producing these details before the family had researched them, creates a combination that is statistically distinct from random coincidence. Whether that argument is persuasive depends in part on how rigorously one accepts the account of the timeline, which ultimately rests on the testimony of the parents themselves. This is the core epistemic difficulty. The evidence is largely testimonial, and testimonial evidence, no matter how sincere, carries limitations that physical evidence does not. In 2003, James Leininger's family made contact with surviving members of Fighter Squadron VIF F-20 and with the family of James Huston Jr. The reunion was documented. Members of the squadron who met the boy described the experience as unsettling in ways they found difficult to articulate. Whether their reaction constitutes evidence is debatable. What it suggests is that the people with the most direct knowledge of James Huston Jr. found something in James Leininger's account that felt, to them, recognizable. Huston's surviving sister, Ann Barron, met James Leininger and reportedly found certain things about the encounter difficult to explain in ordinary terms. She has spoken about it carefully, without making absolute claims, in a way that reflects the genuine ambiguity of the situation. The family did not approach the meeting seeking validation for a belief they already held. By most accounts, they arrived with a mixture of curiosity and reservation. What they took away from the encounter was, by their own description, complicated. James Leininger is now in his mid-20s. The vivid memories that defined his early childhood have faded, as they typically do in cases like this. He has spoken publicly about his experience with the measured perspective of someone who went through something unusual before he had the cognitive vocabulary to understand it, and who has since had to integrate that experience into an ordinary adult life. He has not become an evangelist for reincarnation. He has not made elaborate claims beyond what he actually experienced. He has described what he remembers, which is now the memory of having had unusual memories, rather than the memories themselves. The fading is itself a detail researchers find significant. Across the cases Stevenson and Tucker have studied, the spontaneous past life memories almost always diminish as the child grows, typically disappearing entirely between the ages of 5 and 8. This pattern does not fit the profile of a fantasy that a child is actively maintaining and developing. It fits the profile of something receding. What that something is, whether it is the remnant of a prior consciousness gradually displaced by the developing present self, or a form of memory contamination that simply loses its emotional charge over time, or something else entirely, is a question that current science does not have the instruments to answer. There are approximately 2,500 cases in the archives at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. They come from every major cultural context. They involve children who have described verifiable names, verifiable locations, verifiable relationships, verifiable causes of death, details that were subsequently investigated and, in a meaningful number of cases, confirmed. This does not mean the database constitutes proof of anything. Every individual case has specific vulnerabilities. Every collection of cases has the accumulated weight of methodological limitations that serious researchers openly discuss. What the collection does represent is a body of documented human experience that does not dissolve under ordinary explanatory pressure. The easy explanations, fraud, coincidence, cultural suggestion, parental wishful thinking, account for some of the cases, perhaps most of them. Researchers who are most familiar with the material tend to believe that a residual group of cases survives rigorous scrutiny in a way that demands a more serious accounting. The question of what that accounting would look like. What framework of understanding could contain the possibility that something of personal identity persists beyond death and finds its way into a new life, is one that neither neuroscience nor philosophy has satisfactorily addressed. The hard problem of consciousness, the question of why there is subjective experience at all, why there is something it feels like to be a living creature rather than simply biological machinery processing information, remains genuinely unresolved. Some researchers in consciousness studies have argued that this unresolved status leaves open more possibilities than materialist orthodoxy typically acknowledges. If we do not yet understand how subjective experience arises from physical matter, we are perhaps in a poor position to be certain about what happens to subjective experience when physical matter stops functioning. That argument does not prove reincarnation. It does suggest that certainty in either direction may be premature. James Huston Jr. was 21 years old when his plane was hit. He had, by the historical record, a brief life. He served. He died in the water somewhere near Iwo Jima in the spring of 1945. For decades, his story existed only in military records and in the memories of the people who had known him. And then, 53 years later, a boy in Louisiana began waking in the night, repeating a name that was not his, describing a death that had not been his, asking to go home to a place he had never been. Whether those two facts are connected, whether James Huston's experience of dying somehow persisted and eventually found its way into James Leininger's waking nightmares, is a question that cannot be answered with the tools currently available to us. What can be said is this: the case was investigated seriously, the details were checked, the timeline was examined, the alternative explanations were tested, and at the end of that process, the researchers who know it best have concluded that something remains that they cannot fully account for. Maybe that something has an ordinary explanation that has simply not been found yet. Maybe the human mind is capable of acquiring and constructing information in ways that current science has underestimated. Or maybe consciousness is stranger than the dominant framework allows, more persistent, more fluid, less tightly bound to the biological structures we assume contain it. A 4-year-old boy woke screaming in the dark, describing a man who had died before his parents were born in a war fought halfway around the world. He knew the ship, he knew the squadron, he knew the names. Explain that. And when you think you have, consider what remains after the explanation ends, because something does remain. It always does.